Hey everybody, my name is Mark, and today we're going to be talking about the Poikilo Tero. All right, so the Poikilo Tero is a knife that I have just gotten a couple of days ago, and whenever I get a knife in, it seems like even like brand new factory knives out of the box, I'll take them apart and I find various things. I'll either find that they are severely over lubricated. I don't know if that's because they're packaging them because they don't know when they're going to sell, and so they just want to, extend the shelf life. I have found under brand new knives, I've taken the scales off, and 3 different times I've found like long hairs that are kind of captured between a liner and the scale. So these people at the factory are not wearing hairnets. It's kind of disgusting, but I'll open them up just to check them and lubricate them the way I like to lubricate them. Just kind of a, get to know you kind of period. So that's what we're going to do today. As I said, I've had a couple of Poikilos. I think I mentioned it in another video. And I had the small prism, which it was a beautiful knife. It was extremely smooth, and I really like that knife. The only problem I had with it is that it is a front flipper, but it's so long, and that knife had it was a hidden pocket clip. So the pocket clip was recessed into the scale, and it had a small, it wasn't a conventional spring. It was basically just a piece of metal that was acting as a spring. And so you couldn't really get any purchase to activate the front flipper. There was no place to grab and get any leverage or anything like that. I really liked the knife. It was a beautiful knife, but because of that reason, I ended up selling it. And when I sold it, it was such a huge knife. I think it was almost a 4-inch blade length, which is big. That's a big knife. When I sold it, I think my ad said something like, "For sale, like new in box, shiny helicopter blade," because that's basically what it was. The strangest part about that knife is that I had the small version, but the regular version of the Prism was almost exactly the same size. And so I never really understood that. I think a lot of people didn't understand that. Why would you have 2 knives like that? They were so close. I was going to sell mine, the small version, which was not small. I was going to sell that and actually buy the regular version because it's, like I said, it was essentially the same size, but it had a conventional pocket clip. So you can actually, it was more usable. The other thing with the pocket clip on the small Prism was that because it was recessed, when you would spring the pocket clip open and try and put it on your pocket, it left probably 1.5 or 2 inches of knife sticking up above your pocket. So that was a little strange. It was kind of a terrible pocket clip design as far as I'm concerned. And Poikilo designs overall, they can be a bit of an acquired taste. They're really well built, and it's kind of like you can tell because the name of the company is Poikilo Blade. You can tell that, they put a lot of their emphasis not only on design, but just their blades in particular. And so all of the blades that I've seen, from, on Poikilo knives are really well done. They're beautiful blades, beautiful blade finishes. And as soon as I get this washer out of here, I'm going to show you kind of up close the blade finish that we're working with today. This is a stone washed, kind of a semi-polished stone washed blade. And it is gorgeous. So we're going to take a look at that. Let me kind of clean it up a little bit. And this knife isn't bad. I got to say, it's pretty clean in there. But you can see the finish on this knife is just really well done. They must have used, I don't know if this is like a glass blast. The whatever media they used had to be really super fine. But this is a beautiful knife blade. I like the profile of the blade. I'm just kind of getting used to this style of blade. I'm an old draw point guy, but the swedge at the top and, it's got a compound grind. This is really nice. This is a beautiful blade. So you can tell Poikilo does not mess around with their blade finishes. So on this side of the scale, this would be the lock side. These are nested liners, and basically, I'm not going to take this lock bar out because of the way it's kind of in there. This is the only thing that's, kind of in this side of, on this side of the scale. And so I'm not going to take that out, but it's just basically 2 screws, and that is the lock bar assembly. And to adjust it, if you wanted to like decrease the detent at all, you would have to take those 2 screws out and kind of bend this lock bar assembly outwards. If you wanted to increase it, you can actually do that, in place, because you just pull it out, and that would be pretty easy. And although, most of the people that are viewing this are knife people and they kind of know all this stuff, the one thing I found when you're doing this is kind of easy to get some kind of a piece of paracord, and I will actually loop it in if I'm going to increase the detent on something, which here lately I've had a couple of knives come in and they had super weak detents. So I'll put something like this on there, and I'll be able to better see because my fingers aren't all in the way. And I'm trying to, judge how much I'm increasing the distance, and I'll just find a point, like a static point on the scale side, and then, find the closest edge to it on the lock bar assembly. And I will just kind of put tension on that out. And sometimes you got to over tension it to get it to snap back, and then, where you've made some kind of progress. But I find that it's easier to wrap something in there and kind of use it as a tool to pull. So, that's what I use. So anyway, this side is done. We're not going to take that down anymore. This does have hidden screws for the pocket clip, which is great. So that screw is right there, and it's also holding, it's the second screw for the lock bar assembly. So that all looks pretty good. So now we've kind of gotten this cleaned up from all the factory over lubrication and schmutz that's on there. And so now that looks pretty good. You can see they do a really good job. Like these are really well machined. And so it doesn't really have a detent ramp right here. So you'd be able to see, and I've got I think it was the Avant that I got in, and it's really well done too. But right here at the beginning of the track for the detent ball that you can see, the detent hole itself is really well done, and you can see the track, and then there is no ramp here for the detent. ball to kind of ride up on before it gets on the blade surface. But this is an incredibly smooth knife, and so basically I think that the detent ball on the lock bar assembly is probably really close to this edge when the knife is, you know, in the handle basically before it's deployed. So it's got to be a real close tolerance, and they've achieved that. So, but there is no ramp here. So now we're gonna throw this thing back together. And what I like to do is, and I've talked about this in some other videos, this KPL bottle with the needle applicator, they're great and they're handy, and it's much better than just having, you know, just a top on it like a Visine bottle, and you're just kind of splash away like, you know, you're putting out a fire. So it's kind of handy in that respect, but from what I've seen and in the use that I've, you know, since I've started using these, the little drop that it'll put out is huge. You know, that's a lot of oil coming out of that little needle tip. And so if you are going to put just, you know, like lightly lubricate, and you're trying to put just a couple of drops, you know, maybe on the bearings, and then on the washer, you know, these aren't race washers, they're just regular washers. So you're trying to, you know, make sure that's done. You're going to put a drop of oil maybe in the detent hole on the blade, and maybe swab a little bit into, you know, on the track area. And even though this is not, that's just a line that you can see on the blade, there is no, you know, that's the area where it's going to travel, but it's not really a track. There is no groove there or anything like that, but you can see where it rides. So if you're going to oil all that stuff and you are putting drops of oil, small as they may appear, that is a ton of oil that you are putting out. You know, if you were to increase the size to the same ratio, you're probably, it's kind of like throwing a bucket of oil on your car hood. That is just a lot of oil that you're dealing with. So basically what I started to do, and we're going to put, let's see, I'm going to set everything into the basically show side, even though, you know, both of these are kind of, because that's a nested lock. But we're going to put everything together here and then just drop that other side on. So I'm not going to lubricate the washer on the outside. And you can see that I put this in the same way that it came out. So even though these aren't race washers, you can see a little line there where the bearings have been traveling. And so I'm going to put that still facing the bearings and the blade. So I put that back together just like that. And then kind of what I've started doing, because I don't like all the oil. Like I said, even if you just use drops of oil, if you use a drop, like if I put 2 drops here, so I'm going to put a drop there and a drop there, and then I'm probably going to put my, you know, bearings in there, and I'm going to lubricate those bearings, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side with just small drops. Some of that oil is going to weep out of my pivot. You know, so I'm going to have like an oily mess. Even though you try and just do it as light as you can, you're still going to have some oil. So I just don't like doing that. I want to see. This is the side that looks like, now this is a captured pivot, but it's captured in kind of a strange way. So there's not a D shape on this pivot, but if you look down here, right where the shoulder of the pivot is, you can see these little lines, and it almost looks like a socket or something, like there's flats all the way around this. And so those correspond with, if you look really close here, you can see little flats inside there. So that's how they've captured that pivot. And so that's great. And we're going to kind of do the same thing. and put it back together that way. So what I want to do is make sure that this is going to go together correctly. So we're going to put this back in here. And that is a pretty close tolerance going through there. And then I'm going to twist this and kind of make sure that it's going to sit the way I want it to. So we've got that. And now I'm going to put a bearing in there. So one thing that I do, I don't actually, well, actually I want to swab this area because I want to show you kind of how I do this. So basically what I've started doing is using these. This is a little brush basically that's meant to clean out like a charging port on a cell phone or the little speaker holes on a cell phone and things like that. And this isn't actually like a little bristly brush because they do make those. This is more of kind of a swab. It's like a little tiny Q-tip. And so what I do is I will apply some oil to this little swab on here. And I'll kind of rub it all the way around. And then that is what I use to apply oil to wherever I want to apply it to. So I would take this swab and basically I want to do the shaft of the pivot because it's riding inside, you know, metal inside the blade. So I'm going to swab a little bit on that pivot shaft. And then I'll go ahead and put some down here real quick. And you can see that, you can probably see that little oily sheen that I just put on there. I'm telling you folks, that is all you need. This is lubricated now. You don't have to see a little pool of oil to know that this is working and it's going to be lubricated. You know, you just don't. So that is how I do those. And you can see that it's just a very small amount of oil. And so the only thing that I will oil kind of heavily, and especially when I'm putting skiffs in and I take them out of the package, the skiffs aren't really lubricated. So, but this knife, I can tell, like you can feel this bearing and it feels kind of dry. These are cage bearings, and if you watched one of my last videos of my cyber tricks where I was replacing the bearings in there, because the bearing cage had splits so that they could force these little ceramic balls in there. But it didn't work very well, and so if you ever service the knife, the balls would just fall out all over the place. And in that video, I was handling these very carefully. And at the end of the video, I kind of showed there was like 6 little balls down in here in this work mat. And it was just ridiculous. So anyway, because this is a cage bearing and these ceramic balls are not only riding against the washer and the blade, but they're also much more surface actually inside the cage itself. So that's where 90% of the surface that it's going to interact with, those little balls, is going to occur. And so basically what I do, and I got this from Tim over at Discerning Man. He's got a website over there, and he's an excellent reviewer. He really knows what he's talking about. But I like to work some lubrication into the cage and around those balls, kind of spinning the balls as I'm working it in. And so, you know, in my estimation now, this is lubricated. And that's kind of the way I do that. So we got that in there. We're going to drop that on there. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the blade in there. And that pivot is lubricated, so we're good to go with that. We can go ahead and do this other bearing set. So we're going to put a little dab of oil, and we're going to kind of work it in. And we just leave kind of a sheen of oil on the outside of the cage, but we've effectively gotten oil all around those little ceramic balls. So we got that going. And then I'm going to go ahead and there's really not a lot of need to do this because I just lubricated, you know, those bearings so well. But I'm going to go ahead and put like a little coat of oil on that washer, and we're going to drop the washer in there. So we got that, and then we're going to start putting this back together. So I'm going to move this up a little bit so it's closer in the frame. We've got the blade stop pin, and then we have another pin in the back for the back spacer, and then we've got some small pins for the back spacer as well, which is nice. And then we're going to go ahead and drop our back spacer back on there. Just like that. And then we are going to, I've got a screw, basically the only external screw on this, and it comes through and it engages in this hole right here. So this is a female and it's threaded. And so this external screw is going to go all the way through this scale and the back spacer and screw into here and kind of tighten everything up on the back side. So it's really only two. It's just the pivot and that back screw there. And then as we saw, the pocket clip has a hidden screw. So now we can go ahead. I've got the washer in here. So I'm going to put this back together. And kind of fit all the pins in. And I hope I've done this correctly. I have a feeling that I may have screwed up one of these pivot screws because nope, that was correct. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and turn this over, and we're gonna put our last screw in the scale back here. All right, so now we're back together, and this knife is lubricated, and I have got everything back together. The spacing on the blade between the scales looks correct. So I'm going to give this an initial kind of snug up. And because it's on, one thing that I've seen is when you've got a knife and it's on bearings, you can actually tighten the pivot up pretty well, pretty tight. And you're not going to, you know, it's not going to bottom out like if you're on a washer system. And so you've just got, you know, like phosphor bronze, or you're working with a Spyderco. And some of these pivots have like really aggressive thread pitch. And so you can be trying to tune a knife with phosphor bronze washers, and every little minute change that you make in this pivot makes a huge difference to the action. And it's kind of, you know, it can be kind of a pain to tune those knives. But on a knife with bearings in it, you can pretty much snug the pivot up pretty tight. And if anything, when we check it, we may have to go back and like tighten it a little more because this action is going to be so smooth. So we're going to check that it's really smooth. I think what we're going to do is, I don't know, it's pretty close. We're going to check. We didn't adjust the detent at all, but every time I have a knife apart, just for safety, because, you know, I'm carrying these in my pocket and it's tip up. And I actually had a knife, I forget what kind it was, but it was a front flipper, or yeah, it was a rear flipper, and it had a pretty big flipper tab here. And it got involved with something else in my pocket. And when I went into my pocket to reach for something, that blade was probably open like this much. And I got really lucky that I didn't cut myself. And immediately I bought 2 of those knives, and I gave them to coworkers, and I told them to be careful with them. But I won't carry something like that anymore. So, you know, on flippers like that with a big flipper tab back here, I'll keep the detent, you know, pretty stiff because I don't want it to come apart of my pocket. So this action looks pretty good. I just want to make sure that it's not too drop sheddy. And then, as I said, even though we didn't adjust the detent, I'm going to try and defeat that detent, see if I can get it to pop out of there, which I can't. So it's not bad. I'm going to give it just a little. Yeah, I think that's it. So we now have our knife back together, and it's a beautiful knife. You can see it's got fairly aggressive milling on the outside, and it's all diagonal. It's real clean looking. It's got the little purple pivot collars for whatever reason, but I even like those. It looks pretty good. I think there's another version of this knife that has a different finish on the pocket clip, but I gotta say, I don't mind this black on here. It looks pretty decent. And unless you were gonna get a real Damascus finish, you know, I would never do, I'm like staying away from the lightning anno and all that stuff. I think the only reason that's hitting the market so hard is because people want the, you know, Damascus clips and things like that, and it's much more expensive. So they're trying to, you know, achieve that same kind of look, or, you know, just a fancy look or whatever with that lightning anno. And I'm not a huge fan. I think it never ends up looking, you know, kind of the way I want it to, and it damn sure doesn't look like Damascus anything. So anyway, this is the Poikilo Tero, and I really appreciate you guys watching. Thanks very much.